Hello everyone, it's your host, your friend, your boy, Jet Black, the one and only, with another exciting video. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about my day-to-day on July 12th, 2020, and what my plans are for tomorrow, July 13th, 2020. In case you guys just want to skip around, I'm going to have a table of contents available in the description box below with timestamps. So if any of the topics in the table of contents sound more interesting than any other topic, feel free to just navigate to the topic that you want to hear more about. And feel free to skip all the topics that you don't want to hear about. But if you want to hear about everything, then feel free to stay tuned and continue from the beginning. Also, I just want to remind you guys, if you guys want to message me about anything, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, and feel free to join our Discord, link available in the description. Also, anything and everything that we talk about in this video, there should be some link available in the description box below for you to click on in order to explore said topics further. Like if you hear something and you're like, oh, that's cool, I want to learn more about it, there should be a link in the description that'll help you to learn more about it. So without further ado, let's start with our first topic in the table of contents, and that's, and I've never said this word out loud before, Pericutaneous space might explain what a Psi-Ball is. So let me explain exactly what I'm talking about. Also, I want to show you guys a quick image. This is from the WikiHow on how to make a Psi-Ball. But you guys may not know what a Psi-Ball is, so let me explain a few things. So when I was younger, I used to see tutorials online for how to create a Psi-Ball, similar to that WikiHow article, but a lot of the tutorials that I saw were like YouTube videos, and they involved you like visualizing energy pooling between your hands, and if you did it, you'd feel as if you were like holding like a ball of energy, and if you like played around with it, you could like feel it move, or maybe even feel like its temperature change and stuff like that. And for a while, I wasn't sure what caused that feeling, like what made it feel like you were holding something in your hand. When I was younger, I thought it was, you know, the reasons that they were saying, that it was like, oh, it's some kind of like psychic energy or chi energy. Then when I got a little bit older, I was like, maybe it's like self-hypnosis. Like maybe through visualizing it and focusing on it, you know, you're kind of hypnotizing yourself into believing that you're holding something in your hand. But I recently read an article that talks about pericutaneous. I'm going to try my best to say this word. I read an article talking about pericutaneous space, which is the space that's right outside of your body that when it's occupied makes you feel like you're being touched, even if you're not. So there are studies going on where people are trying to determine, you know, how pericutaneous space works. And have you ever seen, like, in a movie, someone will, like, hold their finger really close to somebody else? Normally it's like two kids on a road trip, and one kid will be like, stop touching me, and then the other kid's like, I'm not touching you. Like, they're, like, barely, like, away from them. That's supposedly like pericutaneous space or whatever. So it's just like this distance away where something is just barely not touching you, but you feel this like force between yourself and whatever isn't touching you but is almost touching you. So if someone holds an object in your pericutaneous space, it'll make you feel as if that object is touching you, even if the object is not touching you. Sorry that my thoughts are all scattered. I always do these videos fairly late at night, and this first topic happens to have a word in it that I have trouble saying, so I feel like it's even weirder. But anyways, I think this might explain the weird feeling that people have when they create a Psi-Ball, because essentially I think what's happening is that you're holding your hands within the pericutaneous space of each other. So like this hand is in the pericutaneous space of this hand, and this hand is in the pericutaneous space of this hand. So essentially both of your hands are reacting as if they're being touched by the other hand, but because neither of them are touching, you feel this kind of like invisible force between your two hands. I apologize if I've like done a poor job of explaining this concept. If you guys would like to learn more information about it, I recommend checking out this Science Alert article titled "This Illusion Lets You Feel the Invisible Force Field Around Your Body." I think it's interesting because I can see how people before we had an understanding of pericutaneous space could be perplexed or mesmerized by the idea of like, I feel this invisible force between my hands, and what does that mean, and what can I do with this force? But in reality, it could just be your body, sensing something within your pericutaneous space. It's just one of those senses that everyone has, but isn't as like popular as like the normal five senses. Like it's essentially an illusory form of your like sense of touch, where you're sensing that something is like close enough to touch you, but it isn't actually touching you. But I would definitely like to know your thoughts in the comment section below, because I'm sure that there are people who would be like, no, I don't think it's pericutaneous space. I think, Psi-Balls actually are psychic energy. I could hear other people say, maybe it's like a mix of that as well as like maybe the self-hypnosis thing. Like it could be the pericutaneous space, but the self-hypnosis could also help with the idea that people may feel like heat or cold from it, because pericutaneous space would only explain like the sensation of the two hands touching each other while apart. It wouldn't necessarily explain like a temperature change. So maybe the self-hypnosis is a part of the temperature change thing. I could hear someone giving an argument that it has nothing to do with like self-hypnosis or psychic energy or pericutaneous space. You may have like a third argument or a fourth. You could have like a whole bunch of different reasons for why you think people feel that kind of sensation when they try to like visualize an energy ball on their hand. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below or on our Discord. So the next topic, let's talk about the Shazam documentary that I saw. So I watched a Shazam documentary today. This image is from Shazam's first appearance, Wiz Comics issue number 2. Interesting story about that. So they did a different version of this cover, essentially, where instead of it being called Wiz Comics, they called it something else. And they treated that as the number 1 for some reason. But I think it's the same comic. It's just the cover had like a different name. Oh, and I don't know why I said for some reason. The reason why the first cover had a different name is because they originally wanted to call it something different. They didn't want to call it Wiz Comics. But then when they turned in what they call an ash can copy with the different name, the name was like already taken or something like that. So then they had to change it to Wiz Comics, and they're like, so we already called it whatever it was before on the ash can copy, so that's technically number 1, so this one's number 2 now, and that's why Shazam's first appearance is in Wiz Comics number 2 instead of in Wiz Comics number 1. So I thought that was a weird fun fact. But I learned a few things from that Shazam documentary that I didn't know before. For example, Shazam was one of the first superheroes to get their own live-action film serial. I wasn't aware of that. So I knew that like Batman had old-school film serials. I knew that Superman had old-school film serials, which are like these black and white short films. But I don't think they necessarily have to be short films. I just know that serials are like serialized, meaning they're like films that are kind of like episodic, like you'll watch one and then you'll watch another. And I think they're normally short, actually, now that I think about it. Like, I think a film serial is like a fairly short live-action film that's like split into parts and you watch them like one part at a time. But I knew that Batman and Superman had old school live action film serials. And I think I was aware that Shazam had one, but I wasn't aware that Shazam was like one of the first ones, like one of the first superhero film serials. I think the documentary might have said that he was the first one to get his own film serials. I'm not sure if that's true. That's why in my notes I was like, he was one of the first. I don't know if he was the very first or not. But scrolling through, Captain Marvel Jr. was one of the first handicapped superheroes, and I did know that. But I guess it was something. I mean, it's weird to say that I did know it. I knew that he was one of the first, but again, I think it's like the documentary said that he was the first. But I always take stuff like that with a grain of salt, because a lot of people will say that like Superman's the first superhero, but it's kind of debated because there are some like Hulk comics characters that are fairly similar to like superheroes, but they may not have like superpowers, but they were like pre-Superman. So I don't know, like you could argue that there could have been like a handicapped Hulk comics character that I'm just not aware of, or maybe even the documentary people weren't aware of, you know, would change your perspective. But Captain Marvel Jr., I think they claimed, was the first handicapped superhero. I thought that was cool. And they also claimed that Elvis based his style off of Captain Marvel Jr. Like the way that he like prepared his hair and everything is designed off of Captain Marvel Jr. And I thought that was like an interesting concept. Because I imagine if anyone were to see Captain Marvel Jr., they would probably assume that Captain Marvel Jr.'s hairstyle was based off Elvis, not the other way around. So I think that's like an interesting idea. Miss Marvel, they claimed, was one of the first female superheroes to have their own comic. Like the title of the comic is like Miss Marvel. And I thought that was really fascinating. Again, I take a lot of that with like a grain of salt, because I hear people throw around first a lot when talking about characters. So I never know if it's true. Like you kind of have to look in and see if it's true for yourself. But I thought it was interesting that the documentary on Shazam mentioned so many first. Like they're like, first film serial, first handicapped superhero, first female lead superhero comic, had all these different first related to the Marvel family. Also, and this is something that I was aware of before, but I'm still confused about. Supposedly, there are a series of Shazam, aka Captain Marvel comics, that are in the public domain, but it seems like even if you tried to write stories based on the public domain versions of the character, you would likely have to change the names of all the characters to avoid trademark issues. Marvel Comics owns the trademark of the name Captain Marvel, and DC Comics claim that they can get away with calling Shazam the name Captain Marvel in their books by not putting the name Captain Marvel on the cover. And I don't understand how that would actually give DC Comics any legal protections from Marvel, considering that using the name inside the book would likely be considered trademark infringement as well. Like you would think, right? I posted a comment like this on the documentary, and I got a reply back from someone who said that Marvel ended up suing DC at some point, and an agreement that was brought about from the lawsuit was that DC wouldn't put Captain Marvel on the cover of their books. They would just say it inside. So it's like a special thing that DC is allowed to do, but not necessarily everyone is allowed to do. I'd have to look into that more. Similar to like how the documentary made claims of people saying like, well, this was the first this and this was the first that. I would also need to look into what this commenter said about like the special arrangement between DC and Marvel, just to double check. But I noticed that on the public domain superheroes wikia, they tried to make the claim that if you wanted to write your own Captain Marvel stories, that you could do the same thing that DC did. They were like, you could just not put it on the cover, but then inside the book you could just call him whatever you wanted. And I saw someone asked like a lawyer about that on a website for legal advice, and the lawyer was like, I don't understand how that would help you. Like they were like, that would just be infringement. So I've heard a lot of different things on the subject. I personally wouldn't take the risk unless I changed all the names. I do think trademarks make it really weird to try and use public domain superheroes who are still used by big companies today, big companies who own the trademarks over that character's like likeness and all the character names and things of that nature. And it's even worse because those characters have elements to their history that are not public domain. So if you try to write a Captain Marvel story and you accidentally mention something that you really don't have the rights to use, it can really mess you up because suddenly you're in legal trouble because you went beyond just using what's public domain. So I think it's always a slippery slope trying to mess with that kind of thing. I also watched a Superman documentary today. I didn't have like a generic picture of Superman, I just realized. But I do have a picture of Superboy that I'm going to show again later, so I guess I'll show this. So the Superman documentary that I watched today, I learned a few things from that. Like, I didn't know that the reason why Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane received their own comic series back in the day was because of the popularity of the characters in the Superman live-action TV show that was being released during that time. So essentially, Jimmy Olsen, from what the documentary said, was a fairly popular character on the Superman TV show. And due to his popularity on the TV show, they were like, Jimmy Olsen needs his own comic, because even if you can't relate to Superman, because Superman has like all these amazing superpowers, you could relate to Jimmy Olsen since he's like a regular guy, and you could still feel like you were Superman's best friend. So they were like, cool. So for boys, to give them that like relatable character, we'll make like a Jimmy Olsen book. And then for girls, to give them like a relatable character, we'll give them like a Lois Lane book. And then that's how those books came about. I originally wasn't sure why Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane got their own books. I kind of assumed it was just a Superman fever kind of thing, where they were like, oh man, we gotta create more Superman content to appeal to all these fans. We already got like a bunch of Superman content out there. What do we do next? Like just another Superman lead book? And I thought they just started picking random elements from Superman and just being like, well, screw it. Jimmy Olsen gets a book. And like Lois Lane gets a book. Like I thought it was more arbitrary. But it sounds like, in a way, there was like a demand for it. So they were like, oh, if that's what people want to see, then that's what we'll give them. So I thought that was cool. Also, if you guys haven't looked at any of these Jimmy Olsen comics, a lot of the Jimmy Olsen comics, and even a few of the Lois Lane comics, involve them like seemingly receiving powers and stuff like that. Like in this one, it seems like Jimmy Olsen gains the abilities of the Legion of Superheroes. But there are plenty of crazy Jimmy Olsen covers that I've seen, where like sometimes he turns into a giant monster, or sometimes he's like hanging out with like gorillas. They make it where Jimmy Olsen has like all these like incredible adventures that seem really out there even by today's standards. So if you're looking for something crazy to read, maybe check out some of these old Jimmy Olsen books. It might be worth your time. Or some of the old Lois Lane books. Let's see. Oh yeah, so I'm still confused on how Superman eventually gained the ability to fly. So I've heard that the old Superman radio show was what first introduced audiences to the idea of Superman flying. But I've also heard that the old Fleischer cartoon introduced the concept because animating Superman jumping everywhere was too taxing. Because the Fleischer cartoons used a technique called rotoscope, where they would have a live-action actor actually jump like on film from different angles based on like how they needed Superman to jump. and then they would rotoscope the film. So they would like take each frame of the film and draw Superman over the actor to give the animation like a realistic flowing movement to it. And I can imagine how having to animate Superman jumping like over and over and over again could be taxing, where if you have him fly, you rotoscope him jumping once and then you don't have to worry about it again. So I feel like the animation one makes a lot of sense. The radio show one sounds very arbitrary. Like if they ever did just make Superman fly, I would ask the question, well, why? You know, like you get, because the radio show you're just talking. Couldn't you just say he like leaps through the air? I guess someone could misspeak once and say, oh, he flew, and then like that could stick. Like I don't know, but both stories I guess seem plausible. I just don't know which one is like the real story. So again, that's something that I'll need to look into more if I want to find a definitive answer for that. So let's see. So I didn't know that the death of George Reeves, who played Superman in live action back in the day, was considered to be a mystery because there are no fingerprints on the gun that shot him. So this was something that was brought up in the documentary as well. They talked about how George Reeves was haunted by the idea that he couldn't find work playing like any role except for Superman. Like, it seemed like he could only get jobs where he played as Superman, and then he would get called in for jobs at like an irregular basis. So imagine training your whole life to become like an actor, and all you want to do is like act in things. But then you get like typecasted, where it's like you can only play Superman, and then you have to like wait for a Superman role to appear for you to actually like make a living. Like you're like, acting is all I know, but I can only ever do Superman roles, but they don't need Superman roles all the time. And a lot of people believe that he like killed himself. I think that's like what the agreed upon like cause of death is for a lot of people, that it was like suicide. But the documentary started by saying it was suicide, and then they were like, but really we don't know, because the forensics say that we don't know who actually pulled the trigger. There's no like identifying stuff on the gun to let you know. So I thought that was like a weird fun fact. Like it was something, and it's not a fun fact at all, but it was just a weird like trivia thing for them to throw in. The documentary overall had like a weird tone to it, because it starts off, I think, pretty like on a strong note. Superman, when he's like the quote unquote first superhero, is taking the world by storm. Everybody loves him. But a lot of the documentary talks about like how Superman's popularity continues to falter throughout history. And at every moment where it seems like Superman is suddenly becoming popular, something happens where it's like, and now people don't care about Superman. And oh look, Batman's getting a movie, and now people care about Batman more, and stuff like that. So I will say that documentary does kind of get depressing at times, like when it comes to just the history of Superman and like his decline. But I do think that the George Reeves story really makes you think about modern actors playing superhero roles and why so many eventually turn away from playing these characters. Right now, we're at a stage where Captain America and like Iron Man are no longer big figures in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They've kind of moved on. And I guess it's good for them to move on, because you don't want the George Reeves thing to happen. You don't want it to be like, I can only play Captain America, or I can only play Iron Man, and I can't get hired for like anything else. Because just like the George Reeves situation, if they don't have like a new Iron Man movie slated for like the next phase, or if they don't have like a new like Captain America movie slated for the next phase, then you're just waiting for the next one. And you're like, what if there isn't a next one? That's like all that people want me for, you know? And I can see how that could be very like taxing on the mind, like something that you wouldn't really want to have to deal with. But moving on from there, DC Universe. So I decided to get a DC Universe subscription today. I used to have the DC Universe subscription service through my dad. Dad canceled, and then I finally decided to get the subscription service for myself today. And I've mainly been using it to watch Adventures of Superboy, which I was on the 4th season of the Adventures of Superboy, but I couldn't remember where I left off in the 4th season. I read like the summaries for each of the episodes, and I couldn't even figure out like where I was in the 4th season. So I decided to say screw it and just skip to the last 2 episodes of season 4. Because they set them up to where it looked like it was like a 2-part thing. So I was like, oh, well, that will probably fill me in on whatever happened in season 4. Like if there was a big shift or change in the show, it'll probably be shown within like these last 2 episodes. The first part of the finale is like a news broadcast, is the way that they do it, where essentially it's like you're watching the news and they're talking about the death of Superboy. And I'm like, did they kill him off? Like, is that legitimately how they end the series? But the end of that episode reveals that Superboy like faked his death in order to try and figure out the culprit of a crime, because essentially someone tried to kill Superboy. And Superboy realizes that someone tried to kill him, so then he essentially pretends to die. And then once the person who tried to kill him comes out and goes, I killed Superboy, what are you going to do about it? Superboy's dead, so if he's not here, no one can stop me. Excuse me. And then Superboy rolls up on him and he's like, I'm not dead. Attempted murder, you confessed. Got him. And that's how that one ends. So I'm like, yeah, that seemed like a pretty standard Superboy story. It was just portrayed in a kind of boring way, because it's just like watching the news. So I was like, that's whatever. Then the second part of the second part of the finale has nothing to do with the first part of the finale. And in it, Superboy has lost his powers. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe they're going to end the series by having Superboy be like, well, I don't have powers anymore, so I guess I can't be Superboy. But instead, it's about like this crystal that he needs to get, and if he finds this crystal, it'll allow him to not only get his powers back, but it'll also help to like evolve his powers further. So essentially, there's like this hologram from Krypton that says, like, this isn't even your final form, Superman. Like, if you can prove yourself by finding this crystal and returning it to this terminal, then you'll get your powers back and your powers will be better than they ever have been. But if you don't do that within like the next 8 hours, this terminal will shut down and you just will be depowered forever. And I'm like, well, this is the last episode of the series, so they actually have like some pretty high stakes here. You know, they could end this episode and he just not find the crystal, or he finds the crystal and it's like, oh, time's up. The 8 hours have passed. Throughout the episode, without his powers, he's trying to search for this crystal, which they believe fell out of his ship when it crash landed on the Kent farm. So he's like, it must be like around like where I grew up, so I need to go back to like my hometown. And I think he's already in his hometown, like at the beginning of the episode, which is fairly convenient, to be honest. His co-workers from the agency that he works with that investigate like paranormal activity, because Adventures of Superboy is weird. It's like a 20-year-old Superman, Superboy, and he starts off like in college, and then a few seasons in, he's like working for this bureau, and he works with Lana Lang, who's like his love interest. And the bureau kind of reminds you of the Daily Planet, but they're not like a newspaper. They're like paranormal investigators. They try and figure out like, did aliens show up? Or was it like a ghost-based thing? And that's kind of cool. Like, I kind of like that a little bit more than the Daily Planet thing because it makes his normal life also kind of weird. And it also explains why the people he works with would have such a vested interest in, like, Superboy. Because I understand why you would care about, like, a superhero. Like, that makes sense. Just in general, like, if superheroes were real, of course you would. But I feel like you have even more of a vested interest if your whole organization is based on, like, investigating aliens and stuff like that. Because Superboy seems to be very open about his origins, that, like, he is from Krypton and he is, like, an alien who just happens to look like a man. So the Bureau does want to learn more about Superboy and, like, write stuff up on Superboy, and that helps fuel Lana Lang's, like, infatuation with Superboy. That not only is she, like, in love with him, but it's a part of her job to, like, investigate him and learn more about him. So the organization that Superboy works with essentially learns about, like, the rocket ship that crashed on Kent Farm like 20 years ago or so. And they're starting to suspect that maybe Clark Kent, who works with them, is Superboy. And Lana Lang feels like she knows for a fact that he's Superboy, and she's going to try to prove it. So that's, like, the B plot of the episode. And throughout the episode, Lana Lang keeps, like, running up on Clark Kent and, like, stabbing him with a pin and, like, making him bleed and shit. And she's like, I know you're Superboy, but if you were Superboy, this pin wouldn't have, like, hurt you. And instead of giving up, like, the first time, she just keeps stabbing him. And his reaction gets, like, more, like, upset, like, every time she does it. And she'll do it and then play coy, like, oh, yeah. And then she'll just, like, shank him again. And that got, like, a honest laugh out of me. I thought that was crazy. But he gets the crystal and he gets his powers back by the end of the episode. And then Lana Lang rolls up on Superboy and goes, hey, I saw you meaning Superboy, stub your toe earlier, meaning you don't have powers right now, which explains how when I stabbed Clark, that he, like, bled, which means when I stab you, you'll bleed. And then she, like, stabs him in his chest, but it, like, bends the needle, like, it doesn't go through. And then Superboy's like, you just seem really silly. Like, you need to calm down. And then he leaves. But then at the end of the episode, Superboy is getting inside of a car with Lana Lang. And as he bends over to get in the car, she attempts to stab him in the butt. And then it freeze frames. And that's the end of the entire series. So they essentially imply at, like, the very end of the series that Lana Lang would have stabbed him in the butt and the needle would have bent, right? So they're saying that Lana Lang does learn his secret, I would say. And there's really, like, a cliffhanger, I guess. Because it's like, does she learn the secret from that? Or does he, like, explain it away somehow? We don't know. Because they never made any more of the Adventures of Superboy. So it doesn't have, like, a real finale. It kind of just ends on the cliffhanger of maybe Lana Lang does know who he is. Maybe she doesn't. But I thought that was interesting. Next up, so I've started reading War of the Gods, which is a comic that is available on DC Universe. It was an old 90s comic event that essentially describes the witch Circe casting a spell that essentially brings about the gods of every pantheon. So we have, like, Babylonian gods, Egyptian gods. We even have, like, alien gods, like the gods of, like, Thanagar. We have African gods. Pretty much a whole bunch of different pantheons of gods. They all come back, and most of them want the same thing. They seem to all want to essentially bring about the apocalypse so that they can then recreate the world. So the earth is being, like, rocked to its core because all these different apocalyptic scenarios are happening at the same time, and the Earth superheroes are trying to like stop the world from being destroyed, and they're trying to stop Cersei and her plan. And it seems like Cersei's plan is to essentially become all powerful. And at a certain point in the comic, she's like, aha, so I knew that if I did this, that Earth's magic-based superheroes would get together and they would try to cast one big spell to stop the apocalypse. And she's like, I've set up like a magic siphon so that when they try to cast that spell, I'll just absorb all of their power into me, and then I'll have like the might of all of DC's greatest magical characters inside of me, and I already have like taken control of like all the gods, so I'll just be like uber powerful beyond like any form I've ever had before. So there's a lot going on, and the story actually follows a lot of different characters throughout the DC universe, so it jumps around a lot. Everybody seems to have something to do in the story. I will say that the first issue, it's the most straightforward, but somehow because of it, it's like the most confusing once you learn more about the story. Because the first issue makes it seem like Cersei only brought back the Greek gods and the Roman gods. And the Greek gods and the Roman gods are like, you're a pretender. Like, I'm Mars, I'm the god of war. And then Ares is like, no, I'm Ares, I'm the god of war. And then they fight. You know, they're doing stuff like that. And then it's like the Greek gods pick Wonder Woman to be their champion. So it's like, this is our Earth champion, and she's stronger than whatever champion you guys have. And then the Roman gods are like, well, we picked Shazam. He's our champion, and he's like more powerful than Wonder Woman. So it ends up being a fight between the Greek and Roman gods and between Wonder Woman and Shazam, but only for that first issue. Then as like the rest of the event goes on, I haven't finished the event. I still need to read the last issue of the event. But as the event goes on, it becomes a lot more than that. Like, it's not just the Greek and the Roman gods fighting each other. It's all these different gods from all these different pantheons around the world trying to cause the apocalypse, and different superheroes who are related to each of those gods facing off against them. So there's a scene where Aquaman has to fight the Babylonian god Tiamat, and Aquaman is trying to like call on the life of the ocean, and as he's calling on like all these sea creatures to help him, he gets a message from Poseidon, and Poseidon's like, I'm busy like fighting like Neptune. Like, he's like, I don't have time to deal with whatever you're doing. I'm still dealing with the stuff from like issue 1. And then Aquaman's like, shut up. Like, I'm not trying to call on you like right now. He's like, I get it. And a lot of the DC superheroes are actually pretty disrespectful toward like all these different gods. They're like, it's kind of your fault that this is happening, so we don't like you. So in many cases, it's like superheroes directly fighting gods. And it's not a lot of superheroes being like, well, I guess I'm going to team up with this god. Like, a lot of times, the heroes that you think would team up with gods are like, nah. Like, I'm on Team Earth. Because that seems to be the like main consensus. I've noticed that all the superheroes are like, it doesn't matter like what gods you believe in or that you follow. We all live on Earth, and if Earth's getting destroyed, we gotta defend Earth. So it's like the gods fighting against each other for control, and it's Earth superheroes fighting against the gods for the sake of their world. So War of the Gods is actually a pretty interesting event that I had never heard of before today. I thought that was cool. Also, I learned about this character, Son of Vulcan. Son of Vulcan is a DC Comics character that they actually got from another company, and then they really never used, and then they used him in this event, and then he apparently dies at the end of this event. I haven't read the end of the event yet, but his Wikipedia is like, yeah, they like never used him, and then they put him in War of the Gods, and then he dies at the end of War of the Gods. but his powers are kind of similar to Shazam's. So you know how Shazam has the abilities of all these like legendary figures, like the strength of Hercules and like the wisdom of Solomon and stuff like that. Son of Vulcan's kind of like that, but he has all the powers of the gods of Olympus. So he has just all the powers of the Olympians in like one being, which kind of makes it weird that he's not the representative of the Greek gods instead of Wonder Woman. But whatever, it seems like he would be the better choice. But Son of Vulcan, they eventually introduced a new version of Son of Vulcan in like 2005. This guy. And the new Son of Vulcan actually is really interesting. I want to read his run. I think it's only like 6 issues. But they introduced the concept of a metavirus. So in DC Comics continuity, they have this thing called the metagene. And the metagene is what gives a lot of DC Comics superheroes their powers. The metavirus is a virus that when you catch it, it gives you a metagene. So it like gives you a superpower, but it also makes it where if you touch someone, you like transmit the metavirus and you give them superpowers. So that's pretty cool. Like I'm a fan of that. And I would love to see the metavirus stuff come back, by the way, because that just seems like a cool premise. But what I really like about Vulcan, other than his design, because his design is pretty clean, is that he fights human-Martian hybrids, which right now is super relevant within DC Comics because they've introduced the idea that human-Martian hybrids are the apex predators of the multiverse, and that they're like extremely powerful beings. Like Lex Luthor eventually became Apex Lex, and he was strong enough to like fight against the Justice League by himself. He did have some additional buffs. He wasn't just like Apex Lex, but still, he's a force to be reckoned with now that he's like half human, half Martian. It's supposedly like a really big deal to be half human, half Martian. So to have a character like Vulcan, whose whole thing is like, I slay the apex predator of the multiverse, that kind of makes him, another tier above that. I think that's really interesting. I also find it interesting because in like a previous video that I did, maybe like a day or two ago, I think like a couple days ago, I made a video talking about researchers who are trying to figure out if there's a gene that gives you like psychic abilities, which I know sounds really weird. It's like a parapsychology study where they're essentially trying to find people who claim to have psychic abilities and then look through their like genetic history and see if they can identify like genes that they possess, like common genes between people who claim to possess different psychic abilities, to see if there is a specific gene to look for to determine whether or not people have like psychic powers, or at the very least to determine like if psychic powers come from some genetic source. So whenever people bring up like the X gene from like Marvel Comics or the meta gene from DC Comics, I think about like the Psi gene study, and I find that to be like a interesting real world parallel, I guess. Like people are researching the idea of what if there is a gene that just gives you superpowers. So I think the metavirus sounds cool because it makes me think of like, well, what if there was like a Psi virus and it like worked a similar way but with like the Psi gene. Also, whenever human Martian hybrids come up, it makes me think about like the Rh negative super hybrids, which I did a video about that, I think either earlier this week or last week. But essentially, the Rh negative super hybrids are people in the real world who have Rh negative blood, who believe that because they have Rh negative blood, that they are human Martian hybrids. And a lot of people who believe that also believe that they have like alien abilities, like they have like superpowers from it. And there are communities of Rh negative superhybrids who essentially use their beliefs as an excuse for like racism. And they talk about a lot of like white supremacist ideals based around the idea of Rh negative superhybrids being like white people and being superior kind of thing. It's really gross. But it makes the concept of Son of Vulcan kind of interesting, because if you try and do like a real life parallel kind of thing, you could make a Son of Vulcan comic that's about fighting like white supremacy in a way. Like it's like a weird connection. But yeah, I feel like all things get weird when you try to like loosely connect comic book stuff to real world stuff. But that's what I was thinking about. So when I heard about Son of Vulcan, I was like, ooh, Psi-Gene virus, or ooh, like fights like white supremacists or whatever. This could be interesting. Like I could see that being like a story. Also, apparently Son of Vulcan appears in New 52 continuity, which I thought was interesting. Because you could argue that him fighting human Martian hybrids is irrelevant. Like his main rogues gallery is made up of human Martian hybrids. So he's fighting the apex predators of the multiverse on like a regular basis. But you could argue, well, his character existed before they introduced all the apex predator stuff, and you could argue that, like, well, if he's no longer in continuity, it shouldn't matter. But considering that he is still in continuity, it kind of does matter. Because it would be interesting if DC kind of pulled him out of the vault and said, like, he is going to be the guy who helps take down any of these, like, apex predators. Because Perpetua, who's the current big bad in DC Comics continuity, she's like, the apex predators are her army. So, like, these human Martian hybrids, she wants to create more of them because that's, like, her fighting force. So they need to pull out Son of Vulcan, because he's essentially like an apex predator slayer. I just think that would be like a cool callback, and it's a callback to a character that essentially never went away. So I think that would be pretty fun. Let's see. Oh, I ended up wrapping Son of Vulcan into I got a subscription to DC Universe. But he actually was supposed to be after I talked about another topic. So I guess I'm going to move Son of Vulcan up here then. Get rid of his entry down here. And now let's talk about DC Unchained, which I just realized I don't have a hashtag for either of those. So Son of Vulcan, put him in here. DC Unchained. Put that in here, and then let me go down to tags. So I already have Son of Vulcan here. I don't think I have DC Unchained, so I'll add that to the tags. But yeah, let's talk about DC Unchained. So I've been playing Marvel Future Fight recently, and I've been wondering, why is it that Marvel has a mobile action RPG, but DC doesn't? Because Marvel has a mobile tactical, well, I'm not sure if it's a tactical RPG, but they have like a more traditional, like turn-based RPG, and DC has like their own version of the same thing. So like if you want to play like a turn-based Marvel mobile RPG, then you play Marvel Strike Force, but if you want to play the DC version, then you play DC Legends. But I prefer action RPGs. And since DC didn't, well, as far as I knew beforehand, DC didn't have their own mobile action RPG, but they do. So I've been playing Marvel Future Fight because DC didn't have one, but DC actually had one the whole time. But it seems like DC's isn't available in the US from what I can understand. I found it on the Google Play Store. And the Google Play Store said it wasn't compatible with any of my devices. And then I watched a video on it, and the video I saw said that you have to go to like the Japanese Play Store or something, and then they let you get it. So it's not as much that it's like not available for my device as much as it is like the US Play Store just doesn't let you get it for some reason, is what I've heard. But I've also heard that the game hasn't received a lot of new updates. Like it's been a while since the game has gotten any new content added to it. So, I don't know, it feels weird. I don't really understand why DC would create their own competitor to Marvel Future Fight, but then not make it available on the US Play Store. Let me know if you guys have played this game before, or if maybe it is just my devices, and you guys are like, I play it just fine on my devices. It could be just that issue, but I would definitely love to hear more about this game. It's something that I would be interested in playing, because if I like Marvel Future Fight, because it's like a fun mobile action RPG, and if this is just that, but with DC characters, considering that I like DC characters more than Marvel characters anyways, then this would be like right up my alley. I think I'd really enjoy it. Beyond that, we have our last two topics. Well, I guess really our last topic before the outro. But what are my plans for tomorrow? So my plans for tomorrow are like the same old as always. I'm going to work, check the mail, call my mom. Maddie was talking about maybe talking on the phone together tomorrow. I think that could potentially be interesting. It's been a minute since Maddie and I have had a phone call. She tried to do a Facebook call with me earlier, like yesterday, and I missed her Facebook call. But I was like, I would prefer not to do Facebook calls. I don't really like internet calls because sometimes the connection can mess up, and I feel like it's more likely for internet calls to mess up than just normal phone calls to mess up. And also when internet calls mess up, I feel like it's a lot harder to identify that they've messed up. So you'll say a whole bunch of stuff and then the other person will be like, I didn't hear any of that. That does still happen on like mobile, but I feel like it happens less often. I do a lot of internet calls for my job, and I don't like doing them for my job at all, because multiple times a week that'll happen. It'll either happen to me or it'll happen to someone else, and regardless of who it's happening to, it's kind of like unnecessarily frustrating. But I just feel like it doesn't happen as much when I'm just like on the phone talking to people. But yeah, Maddie and I might talk on the phone. I'm going to try and finish War of the Gods, so I'll figure out how that event ends. I'm also thinking about starting Son of Vulcan, reading through that, seeing how that goes. Danica lost her phone earlier today, and then found it later in the day. So Danica and I were able to message a little bit, but we didn't get to message a lot. So maybe Danica and I will have a better opportunity of messaging today. I think that'd be cool. Well, I guess tomorrow, because it's not the next day yet, at least not while I'm recording this. It'll probably be the next day by the time you guys see this video. But yeah, those are my plans for tomorrow. So now I think it's time for the outro. I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you guys like this video, make sure to smash that like button, favorite, comment, subscribe, and ding ding ding, ring that notification bell to be notified whenever we do these videos. This is your host, your friend, yep, boy, Jet Black, the one and only, logging out. Peace, guys. Chicka da gal. And feel free to message me on the Discord or in the comment section below about any of the things we discussed or any topics that happen to be on your mind. Peace.